Hello, and you're very welcome back to Shattered Lives. I'm Ciaran Bradley. The murder trial of Gerry the Monk Hutch resumed for another day in Dublin Special Criminal Court today. Mr. Hutch is accused of the murder of David Byrne at the Regency Hotel in February 2016. It is a charge that he denies. Being tried alongside Mr. Hutch are two men, Jason Bonney and Paul Murphy. The state alleges that Messrs. Murphy and Bonney provided vehicles for the Regency murder. Both men deny the charges against them. To bring us up to date with the goings-on is our man in court, chief reporter for the Irish Daily Star, Paul Healy. Paul, how are you keeping?
Not too bad. We're another day into this trial now. We're nearing the end. The end game is in sight.
Yeah, for the listeners, I can see the dying of the light in Paul's eyes. Has to be said. There's he was once sprightly and spry, but unfortunately not so much anymore. So we have concluded Tuesday's hearings and evidence. What did we learn today?
Yeah, well, like on the surface of it, I will say that sitting in court today was a little tedious and maybe boring at times in terms of making headlines at first glance anyway. But that's because we basically were going through 83 ultimately separate cell sites in relation to this investigation. So an engineer for 3 Ireland Hutchinson Limited was called to the stand, and he gave evidence of just how phone data would have been sought by Gardaí investigating this case, and he would have facilitated that. And in examining phone calls and texts and location data, they would have received all of this through cell sites across the country. Now, this is very technical, and like as I say, on the surface of it, might seem a little boring, but it became interesting for me anyway. And I'm a bit of a nerd in this, in that when you put it into context, all of these different locations and just the sheer scope of it is fascinating. I think, like, basically how we heard it in court today was each and every cell site across the country that they looked into was listed one by one, and a map of each one shown. But it's only when you compile them all together, and I did compile them all together, like, as there's 83 of them. Maybe I've missed one, I hope I haven't, but I think I've got them all. That's 83 cell sites across 4 different counties. So you've got Dublin, Louth, Monaghan, Donegal, and there are cell towers located in each of these counties that are pertinent to this overall Garda investigation. And this isn't common for me. I saw someone giving me stick on Twitter saying that I was possibly kissing arse, or whatever way you want to put it. That by saying, the sheer scope of this, I'm just saying from a factual basis, it's obvious. No matter what your opinion is on this trial, even if you are not happy with the way Gardaí investigated it or whatever, that's your personal opinion, it is obvious that the scope of the investigation was massive, because of as I said, this is only just with phone data, 83 separate cell sites, cell towers, in relation to God knows how many phone numbers they looked at, and text data, all of that. It's hard to imagine the scope of it. So, to put it into context, they seized phones from the co-accused men Paul Murphy and Jason Bonney. They seized phones in relation to Jonathan Dowdall, Patsy Hutch. They looked at phone calls and texts that these people were making, and were able to through an analysis, through an expert, their own expert, triangulate the locations of these phones at specific dates and times that were of interest to them, obviously, in the case. So that's, as I said, fascinating and very important. That's why I suppose they've left it to the end. It's very technical evidence, but on Thursday now we're expecting to hear from Sarah Skeed, who was the phone analysis expert, the individual who would have looked at all of this in great detail. And we heard a little bit already about her analysis in relation to Jonathan Dowdall's phone, and where it was, what phone mast it was pinging off on very, very specific and important dates. Not to go over old territory too much, but just to remind our listeners that Jonathan Dowdall said on the witness stand, and his central allegation is that he met Gerry Hutch in a park in Whitehall in Dublin, near Collins Avenue, I think. And this is the location where Gerry Hutch, he says, confessed to him to the murder of David Byrne in the Regency Hotel. And Sarah Skeed's analysis basically showed that on the 7th of February 2016, on the 8th of February 2016, which is the date that Dowdall told Gardaí this happened, his phone appeared to be pinging off a mast cell site in the Navan Road area, which is where he was from, where he was living, and then later in the Dundalk area. So it didn't correlate with his allegation that he was in Whitehall. So, but also key to that is that she was able to discover that he was in the Whitehall, specifically Collins Avenue area, the day before, on the 7th, at 3:15 in the afternoon. So that's when that caused Dowdall on the stand to say maybe he got the date and time wrong, although, you know, it was pointed out to him by Brendan Grehan that this is something significant and you think he'd remember when it happened. But like, all of this is key to the case in that, that cell site analysis was able to corroborate certain elements of Dowdall's story, in that he said he got a phone call from the wife of Patsy Hutch shortly after 8 o'clock on the 8th of February, and he said that she had phoned him to tell him that Eddie Hutch had just been murdered. And the cell site analysis does show that he did actually receive a phone call around that time from Patsy Hutch's wife. So it's very important. This is obviously a huge part of the case in proving certain things, what happened and where, and certain dates and times. So we didn't go into detail in relation to all of these locations today, but if you put them all on a list, you can see, if you've been following the case, the different cell towers that they looked at correlate with certain locations that are pertinent to this case, basically. And that's what makes it interesting once you contextualize it.
Yeah, and when they're analysing this data, is this data in relation to calls and texts made from devices at that time, or is it just a kind of general signal that would give off one's location at any point over a certain period of time?
Well, I suppose we're going to hear more detail in relation to that, and I'm not an expert on this, but it's location data in terms of when phone calls and texts were made in relation to these phones. I mean, that we've heard that the Gardaí did seek all available phone data from 3 Hutchinson Limited in relation to calls and texts and records of that nature. So everything that they could gather in terms of data, they have. And as I said,
and do they analyze actual phone calls? Are they listening to the conversations, for example? No, that's a privacy issue, of course. Yeah.
No, they wouldn't have been able to listen to phone calls, but they would be able to tell when a phone call occurred, and then from ping from certain cell towers as to the location of where that device would have been at the time. Okay,
lovely. So what do we learn then?
Well, there's 83 different locations, as I said, and some of them it's hard to necessarily know the full context. But for example, as I mentioned, there are there's cell towers in the Navan Road area. We know obviously the importance of that because that's where Jonathan Dowdall lived. Cell sites were examined in the Donamead area, which is where Jason Bonney, where he was observed going to Donamead Shopping Centre, and where his BMW was ultimately seized off him by Gardaí. There are cell sites in the Malahide area. We know obviously Malahide, the industrial estate there, that's where Shane Rowan met with Patsy Hutch in the Malahide industrial estate, and he was being secretly watched by the National Surveillance Unit. And this meeting happened on the 9th of March, shortly before Shane Rowan was then caught with the AK-47 rifles. And then there's cell towers also in, as I said, in Monaghan, for example, Emmyvale. That's the same area that the NSU were watching Shane Rowan, that he stopped in a top garage there. Then they also looked at areas in Portmarnock where Jason Bonney was living, and where he was where this vehicle, the BMW that he was alleged to be driving, that was used to help the hit team escape, where that's where he left his home that morning on the 5th of February. So again, they looked at cell sites there. There's lots of places around the inner city, the IFSC, the inner city, that covers a huge area. I would imagine it's very close to, not too far away from Champions Avenue, where Patsy Hutch's home is. Obviously, the movements of Patsy Hutch and his alleged involvement is a huge part of this case as well. And then there's areas up in Donegal. There are cell sites that were mentioned in the Donegal area. We know that Gerry Hutch and Jonathan Dowdall travelled up that direction. And County Louth as well. There are cell sites in Ardee there where they were observed coming back from the north through that area. And obviously the Gardaí were hugely interested in the movements of Jonathan Dowdall's phone on those dates and times. And we know that Jonathan Dowdall has said things about getting a phone call from his father asking him about booking the room on the 4th of February. So they would have been looking at cell towers in relation to that as well. It just, as I said, when you put a little bit of it into context, you realise that just the sheer scope of it and the amount of data that they had to retrieve is enormous. As I say.
And do the guards have a specified kind of unit, a digital unit, a technological unit that would deal with and pore over all this stuff?
Yes, Sarah Sked appears to be their foremost expert in that, and so I imagine she's going to put an awful lot of this into context when she's called to the stand on Thursday. And as I say, she seems to be the last witness for the prosecution, and we heard today that that'll probably take up the morning, and if there isn't anything sought by the defence, that might be the end of it in terms of her evidence. The most pertinent thing at the moment, the one thing that has already drawn controversy, is her examination of Jonathan Dowdall's phone at that key point in time when he claims this confession happened, and that shows you the importance of the phone data collection evidence in that case, and certainly it's important across the cases. I've mentioned already cell towers that they looked at through 4 different counties. Like when you look at it, like with all of those cell sites across the city, Phoenix Park, all across Swords, North Dublin. I mean, they basically gathered data from cell towers across the entire county of Dublin. I mean, an enormous, hugely populated area, the most populated area in the whole country. So, I mean, that's why I'm saying look at the sheer scope of it. And then, on top of all of that, you've got surveillance officers following these people all over the place. It's just the manpower involved is huge, massive. So from that perspective, when it's put into context, what we heard today for me was completely fascinating, because it was another facet to show, really the amount of manpower and the hours that would have gone into investigating this particular murder.
And other than that, there wasn't anything particularly incredible that stuck out to you, or maybe the rest of the press pack today?
No, that was the most fascinating element today. I think that, as I said, we're wrapping up this case. We have now heard the most important, the most important evidence, Jonathan Dowdall being probably the most dramatic. And this obviously, compared to that, is not as dramatic. But it's a huge central part of the case, because it's something that can be proven, and they can triangulate the movements of these phones to prove the movements of these individuals on key dates and times. It's a very, very important, technical, and maybe sometimes boring when not put into context, but a very, very important part of the case.
Very good. Well, listen, thank you very much for that, Paul. I just wanted to pick your brains on a couple of things. Obviously, we are cognizant of the fact that the next couple of days might be a touch dry for the listener, as try as we might to sex it up. But I just wanted to put a couple of questions from our listeners that we have outstanding here that you may be able to help with. And if not, then that's fine. We'll use the galactic brain of Mick O'Toole when he's back.
I'll do my best.
These both came via DM on Twitter. So, will the tapes and recordings ever be released? I presume this is in relation to when Dowdall was giving evidence. Is there a precedent or regulation behind that? You might be able to furnish us with a bit of info there.
I don't know is the short answer, but I can say that there had already been a request from a solicitor on behalf of I believe Independent News and Media for the entire press group, basically representing to have the transcript of that tape released so that the reports can be accurate. But both sides, defense and prosecution, said that they had no issue with the media reports to date and that everything appeared to be accurate and above board. So effectively there was no reason for this to be disclosed, and the judges ultimately did not favour it, so the transcript was not released in that context. At the moment, that's the only, I suppose, legal way that it can be done, that it can be disclosed, is that the judges authorise it following an application by the media. Now, another application could be made before this is over, but at the moment, that I think is the only legal basis for that being released to the general public. Perhaps down the line when this case is over, maybe through Freedom of Information Act or something of that nature, it could be released. But I don't see it happening in the short to medium future anyway.
That's fair enough. Another quick one from Twitter here was, if Flatcap wasn't going to bother using a disguise, why did Jonathan Dowdall book the room in the hotel? That was one that did make me think.
It's a fascinating question. I suppose I don't really know the answer, but I can talk about it in terms of that's an interesting question. And it's worth discussing. But I'm not trying to be a politician, and say, I'm just being honest in that. Look, Kevin Murray is deceased. He was investigated, and he was going to be charged before the courts. He obviously died of complications from motor neuron disease. But yeah, he didn't make any effort to hide his identity. He was identified pretty quickly, and the speculation was obviously because he knew that he was dying and he had nothing to lose effectively, and so made no efforts to hide himself at that point in time. We don't know the context in which was his thinking prior to carrying out his involvement in the Regency Hotel, but I do recall Jonathan Dowdall being asked by Brendan Grehan something similar, on a similar sort of question. Well, why did they get you to book the room when he could have just booked it himself? And his answer effectively was that he now feels that he was set up, he was naive, and that he booked the room because he was asked. He had no idea who he was booking the room for, he claimed. And, looking back on it, he felt that maybe now he was being used and to have the blame shifted on him in some way, rather than, say, Kevin Murray or the Hutches or whatever. And maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe Jonathan Dowdall was utilised to book the room, to again further separate maybe individuals, because that was a leading theory, that the Hutches were, the Hutch gang was potentially trying to shift blame in the direction of dissident Republicans rather than themselves, and that the blame might go elsewhere. Maybe that's the reason, but the short answer is we don't know. It's a very, very good question. That's the only reason why I think it's worth discussing, because it's a good question, but remember, there's a trial still ongoing. That's important to say, but that's a fascinating question. And do we know the full context, the full reason as to why Jonathan Dowdall was asked to book that room? Effectively, he didn't book the room. His father, and through his wife, booked the room. But he says, he was centrally involved in that process. But yeah, it's a fascinating question. I'm darting around it, but I'm just saying I think it's worth talking about that person's question because it's just interesting. But we don't know the real answer to it. Is the truth.
It's all good. We're back on a slightly firmer ground, actually. Just one from me. Obviously, yesterday we were talking about this curious email, I should say, that came through. I suppose, I'm presuming there was no update, further information on that at all.
I'll be careful about this. I did hear a little bit more about it, but all I can say that's safe to say, I suppose, is I don't think it's being taken particularly seriously. It obviously had to be mentioned because, especially in light of the previous curious development, But I think, look, it'll be looked into, I'm sure. But somebody sent an email to the Central Criminal Court, I believe, to a registrar, making particular allegations again about persons involved, alleged to have been involved in the Regency Hotel shooting. I don't think any basis was provided for that. People make allegations all the time, every day, including on social media, but it's just the context in which it was sent, and it was addressed to the court, the Special Criminal Court, that I think it had to be noted. I don't expect it to be brought up again, but who knows?
Okay, well, listen, that's all good stuff. Thank you very much, Paul. Look, thanks a million for today, and obviously we'll be back to you when we can with regard to podcasts this week when it's relevant.
Yeah, just to fill people in. Look, we nearly weren't going to do a podcast today, but when as I said, we're putting into context those 83 locations, I think it really shows you just the size and scope of the investigation, and it's fascinating. So we will probably do another podcast Thursday, I think, because that'll be when Sarah Sked has given her evidence. That will be worth discussing. But we as we've always said, we'll give you a podcast when we have stuff worth discussing. We're coming to the end game of this trial. I expect next week will be very, very interesting when we hear the concluding arguments from the defence and the prosecution.
Very good. Well, that's as good a place to leave it as any. So, Paul, thanks a million. Speak soon. Take care.
Thank you.